Hello, I'm Tyler Thompson, aka Space Explained, and welcome to another video. As you probably know by now, SpaceX has had plans for an absolutely huge rocket. On the first stage, or Super Heavy, they're planning on having 28 engines to lift the Starship upper stage into orbit. Many people are quick to point out, though, that the N-1, which is the Soviets' moon rocket that was going to combat the Saturn V, used 30 NK-15 engines and failed on all 4 of its flights. Quite spectacularly, too. And the Starship will suffer a similar fate. But will it? I will also go into a few other rockets in this video in history that use lots of engines, including concepts and real flight hardware. But for now, let's get started. So before we get too far into the video, I'd better explain what thrust-to-weight ratios are. They're pretty self-explanatory because it's just the ratio of thrust of the engines compared to the weight of the vehicle. The higher your thrust-to-weight ratio, the more efficient your rocket is. Since the rockets are fighting directly with gravity and can't take advantage of lift vectors like airplanes can, you need to have enough thrust-to-weight ratio to escape the force of gravity. If you have too low of a thrust-to-weight ratio, you'll end up wasting lots of propellant fighting gravity, versus if you have a higher thrust-to-weight ratio, you'll get more energy transferred into making your rocket go up and faster. Typically, rockets tend to run a thrust ratio of around 1.5. This is so that you can get the perfect balance and efficiency of G-loads. To visualize G-load, imagine accelerating in a car. You can feel yourself being pushed back into the seat of the car, and this is what G-load is. G-load is measured by how much more force than gravity you feel. For example, Falcon Heavy has a liftoff G-load of 3.5 Gs. Its G-load is 3.5 times the force of gravity on Earth. The higher your thrust-to-weight ratio is, the higher the G-load. Okay, so getting back to the theme of the video, why is having multiple engines advantageous on a rocket like Starship anyways? The main reason that I can think of is redundancy. If one engine fails on a rocket with fewer but bigger engines like the Delta IV Heavy, it will lose control and explode, versus if an engine fails on a rocket like Starship, it will likely be able to carry out the main goal with the possible sacrifice of a few side goals. We saw this twice on the Falcon 9, one of them being CRS-1, when an outer engine failed and caused the second stage to be unable to boost the secondary payload into its proper orbit. The main mission for the Dragon 1 capsule, however, was a complete success. For rockets like Falcon 9 and Starship that propulsively land, having multiple engines is a big advantage. If you used all 9 of Falcon 9's engines on the final landing burn, it would have way too much thrust and fly right back up into the air unless you had an absolutely perfectly timed engine ignition. To avoid this, you can just light up the center engine and start the burn earlier. If you were trying to land, say, an Alice 5, you would have all the same thrust that you would at liftoff and have way too much thrust and have to have way too accurate of a burn, and so likely you would just go up and back into the air again or start your burn too late and smash into the ground. Even still, the near-empty Falcon 9 with one engine running at its lowest throttle setting still has too much thrust to hover, so SpaceX performed something called a hover slam or suicide burn. This is basically where you light up your engines at the last possible second so you can slow down to stop right as you reach the ground. Luckily, the Merlin 1D engine can throttle, so they don't have to do this exactly at the right time. Now, one rocket that's very well known but very unsuccessful that had lots of engines was the Soviet N-1 moon rocket. This was a rocket that was plagued with problems, and for its first flight did fairly well, making it past max Q, and most of its engines shut down except for one, which caused the rocket to pitch over and eventually crash into the ground, causing a huge boom. The second flight was just something special. It got barely off the pad, and then boom! The biggest non-nuclear, man-made explosion happened that day, as the rocket was fully fueled with RP-1. Its other 2 flights also ended in booms, but despite what people think, this is not because of the number of engines. None of the failures were. Much of it had to do with the fact that the engines that the Soviets had developed, the NK-15, was way ahead of its time, and it would have needed a lot more research to become a reliable engine. Now let's talk about a rocket that has been super reliable and uses 20 engines, not including the auxiliary thrusters, which bring that number up to 32. It has only had a total of 3 failures out of 1,680 launches. This is excluding Vostok, Sputnik, Voskhod, Ploit, Molniya failures, and launches. This has made the Soyuz one of the most reliable and most flown rockets ever. Falcon Heavy has also had a perfect flight record with 27 engines. The Proton also uses 6 engines, which is a relatively high number as far as rockets go, and it's only failed 11 out of 111 launches. Now, let's look at some rockets in history that use less engines. For starters, I think that the original Atlas is a great example. On its first flight as a missile, it had an in-flight failure of one of its engines at T plus 26 seconds, followed almost immediately by the other engine, but because of the delay in engine shutdowns, it ended up tipping over in the air and was terminated. It barely was able to be terminated, though, before it hit the ground. This failure was caused by the sooty exhaust from the turbopump, which clogged up some fuel valves and caused massive loss in thrust. I'll go into more detail on turbopumps and how rocket engines work in a future video, but if 2 engines failed on, say, Falcon Heavy, it would not be catastrophic at all, but it may mean that some secondary objectives may not be achieved, such as landing. The main mission, however, would most likely be a total success. Anyways, this week in space, we saw 7 launches, with China leading off the week with the Long March 2C/E successfully carrying the Yaogan 308 and Apocalypse 12 satellites into orbit. The purpose of these satellites is not yet confirmed. We then saw another launch of a Falcon 9 carrying more Starlink satellites into orbit. This was a pretty amazing achievement for SpaceX because this was the first time that they had successfully launched and landed a booster 10 times. Earlier in the Falcon 9 program, Elon announced that they planned to fly a booster 10 times before needing major refurbishment. So we will just have to see if they choose to keep flying it or if they retire it or what their future plans are for it. The highlight for rocket launches this week, though, has to go to this next launch. Rocket Lab launched their 20th Electron mission, cleverly named Running Out of Toes, on Saturday, May 15th. This was quite a unique mission for Rocket Lab because they would be attempting another recovery of their Electron smallsat rocket. They have only performed this once before on their 16th flight. Liftoff and ascent was amazing. Passed through max Q perfectly. We got up to stage separation, ignition, and then it spiraled out of control and shuts down the engine, leading to the loss of mission. This is a terrible moment for Rocket Lab team, and my greatest condolences to them and their customers. My best guess for what happened to the second stage, though, is that it had a TVC issue, which locked the nozzle in a fixed position and caused it to spin out of control. If you pay attention to the upper right-hand corner of the screen where the telemetry is, you can see that the speed is going up and down very rapidly, indicating that the stage was slowing and speeding itself up, meaning that it was spinning. We can also see that the first stage spinning out of frame immediately after engine ignition, which hasn't happened on any other flights, also backing up my theory that it was spinning. This is kind of a bittersweet mission in my opinion, because even with this tragic failure of this amazing little rocket, they still successfully recovered the first stage, which, as I mentioned before, is something that Rocket Lab has only done once in the past. I also feel like the failure downplayed how big of an accomplishment this is for Rocket Lab. Anyways, hopefully they will be able to resolve this issue soon, and I wish Peter Beck and the team a speedy return to flight. Later in the day, we saw another Starlink launch, which went perfectly. This mission also included small-sat ride shares. So I kind of saw this Falcon 9 launch showing its younger, smaller rocket from another mother, how it's done. 3 days after this, we saw an Atlas V 421 liftoff carrying the SBIRS GEO-5 payload for the United States Space Force successfully into orbit. The numbers stand for the configuration of the Atlas V. The first number stands for the size of the fairing, the options being 4 meter, 5 meter, or none when carrying Boeing's Starliner. The second number stands for the number of solid rocket boosters, the options for this being 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. The third number stands for the number of engines used on the Centaur upper stage, the options for this being 1 or 2, although Boeing's Starliner is the only payload in which the Atlas V has used the 2-engine configuration for the Centaur upper stage. This was a super cool launch since the Atlas V doesn't launch nearly as often as other launchers like the Falcon 9. There was then a Chinese rocket launch with the Long March 4B carrying the Haiyang 2D satellite into orbit. Haiyang 2D is an ocean observing satellite, which is part of a series of satellites planned by China to observe the ocean. This was also the 400th Chinese orbital flight, which was a pretty big milestone. The final event this week in space was Virgin Galactic's VSS Unity suborbital test vehicle. It successfully carried 2 of their astronauts into space, barely past the Kármán line, and then successfully touched down on the same runway it took off from. Anyways, all my sources are in the description below, as always, and you can follow me at Space Explained on Twitter, and the same thing goes for Instagram. My new website, Space Explained website version 1, is also linked in the description in case you want to check out my scripts and learn a little bit more about me. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and do whatever you can to help me end the general public's ignorance towards space. I'm Space Explained, explaining space like never before.